Hello, welcome to the webinar. Do chat in the chat box, say where you're calling in from, where you're based. We're so pleased that you can join us here today with the Tempest Two. So a little bit about the Tempest Two. These are two adventurers, content creators, speakers, and with little to no formal training, they've taken on some of the biggest challenges in the world, including rowing the Atlantic, scaling Mont Blanc, motorcycling from London to Sahara, tackling an ultra triathlon in Patagonia, climbing El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. And they believe that with the right mindset, others can take on similar challenges, whether they be physical or in business or their own life. So before they get started, a bit about Igniting Enterprise, this webinar series. It's presented by the Peter Jones Foundation, and it brings some of that best content that we'd have had at EntFest, our Festival of Enterprise and Entrepreneurship, which the Tempest Two are due to speak at in June. To our attendees, and we want you to challenge the scope of your horizons, think in new ways, and kind of come out with lots of value from the webinar. So this is presented by the Peter Jones Foundation that was set up in 2005 by businessman and star of Dragon's Den, Peter Jones, and our ambition is to champion business, enterprise and entrepreneurship. We believe that with the right mix of opportunities and support, every young person has the potential to achieve great things and the right to a brighter future. We run courses, qualifications and competitions for young people from the age of 6 to 18 and have a vibrant alumni network of ambitious young entrepreneurs. And they're doing great things in business. And we're really excited to be here with the Tempest Two, who are going to be talking about building a growth mindset, what you need to do, and the things that you can take from this webinar that can help you in your own life to move forward. So thank you so much. I'm going to go off and hand over to Tom and James, but keep on chatting, asking your questions in the chat box. We'll come to them at the end. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Katie. Firstly, a big hello from James and I. Obviously, we're gutted that we can't speak at EntFest in June. However, we're hoping we can get some of the stuff we were going to mention on stage with you today. And firstly, an introduction. So my name's Tom, this is James, we are the Tempest Two. And what we want to do over the next half an hour is run you through a series of content that goes into our adventures that we've taken on over the last few years, and some of the key learnings that we've taken from them. I think when we were due to speak in June, we were going to focus really on growth mindset, which we're going to touch on today. But I think we really wanted to pull the idea of resilience through our adventures today, purely because of the environment we find ourselves in over the last couple of months due to COVID and the disruption that every single one of us on this call will have faced, including us. So firstly, we wanted to kind of define actually what resilience is before we move on to a couple of adventure stories. And I think a lot of the time when people refer to resilience, they maybe get it slightly confused with grit and mental toughness. And James and I over the last few years have been in some pretty tough situations and we've had to grin and bear it to get through it, but that isn't necessarily what resilience is. That's kind of grit. And resilience is something that can be learnt, it can be trained, it can be taught, and it's basically a process of reframing a negative situation into a positive. So how you can take the current COVID situation that is big doom and gloom, how you can manipulate it to actually be a positive for yourself. And we're going to go through a series of learnings from adventures that actually started off with this series of text messages. A lot of adventurers have, a background in the military, they're elite. James and I are the total opposite of that. I was in a pub in East London back in 2014, and I'd sent James these text messages after finding out about rowing the Atlantic. And this is the conversation that followed. There was no dramatic backstory. There was no romantic lead up to it. To be fair, it was a couple of drunken texts. And what that did was started a journey for us to completing the biggest challenge of our lives and becoming professional adventurers. And this enormous journey was signed off with a load of emojis. And 18 months later, we found ourselves rowing the Atlantic Ocean. And this was our first adventure we took on. It was a 3,000-mile voyage from Gran Canaria to the Caribbean. We were totally unsupported. We never rowed before. We'd never sailed before. If you could actually see, James and I stood up. We're actually the combined height of an average rower. And this was our big first adventure, and we went into it not really knowing what we were doing, and spent 54 days at sea, overcoming a series of obstacles, which we'll come on to later. But this was kind of our baptism of fire, and then we then took on the Tempest Two as a full-time business. And since then, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've taken on numerous challenges.
Yeah, so I think worth touching on some of those challenges we've done. And as Tom said, our mindset was totally altered by not just the fact that we completed this row, but everything that happened along the way. And what we're going to take you through over the next half an hour or so is those key learnings. And a combination of those is what made us think that we could essentially become professional adventurers in the least traditional sense. So our next adventure after the row, we decided that we really wanted to learn how to ride motorbikes. Naturally, I'm sure everyone's had the same thought. So we did so. We learned how to ride bikes in 4 days. And on the 5th day, the day after passing our test, we rode from London down to the Sahara Desert. And it was as much of a test on ourselves personally as anything else. It was obviously an incredible journey, thousands of miles through Spain and Morocco to get to the Sahara. But it was a real test and a steep learning curve that we wanted to really push this time and see what we can get done in a short period of time. And so from idea to being stood on the edge of the Sahara was just a couple of months. And it kind of proved what we thought we learned in the Atlantic, that you can acquire a skill, go through some tough learnings, but kind of stay strong and eventually achieve some pretty awesome things. So off the back of the motorbike ride, we were thinking about our next big adventure. And for some reason, we ended up deciding that we wanted to take on an ultra triathlon through Patagonia, which is, not the most glamorous place, not the most well-known place, but it is known for being incredibly raw. It's the second windiest place on the planet after the Antarctica, and we were looking at different ways we could explore the region. Again, like all the things that Tom and I do, there's no experience of endurance or running or cycling or whatever. And what we landed on doing was an ultra triathlon, a first of its kind. So a 1,600 kilometre cycle from the north of Patagonia down to the south. And Patagonia is a region that borders both Chile and Argentina, a real long stretch. And we went from the north of the region down to the south on bikes. And then we went straight into a world record ultramarathon, which is where this picture is from, on top of one of the 2 mountain passes. And then we went from that run straight into a 100 kilometre stand-up paddleboard. So one of the more brutal things we've done that required a huge amount of grit, but yeah, incredibly challenging nonetheless, but a pretty awesome experience for us.
Yeah, and at the end of last year, we took on our biggest adventure to date. And this is, I'm sure a lot of you are actually too young to know this, but this is the background from the Apple Mac a few years ago. And the story of this adventure that we took on was halfway through our Atlantic row, we were talking about taking the Tempest Two full time and thinking about next adventures. And James pointed at this picture of El Capitan in Yosemite and joked about climbing it. And we laughed it off, thinking it was totally impossible. And 4 years later, in October last year, we climbed El Capitan, which is a 3,000-foot granite rock face. It is the most famous rock face in the world. I'm sure a lot of you would have seen the recent film with Alex Honnold of Free Solo, where he climbed it without any ropes. We had more ropes than you could possibly imagine. And true to form, we'd never climbed in our lives, and we trained for 18 months, getting ready, learning how to climb, learning how to rope, learning the systems to finally prepare us to spend 3 days on the granite wall. It was without doubt the most challenging thing we've ever done, and for sure kind of delivered the first kind of learning that we want to speak about, which is essentially the art of learning and almost learning and becoming good at learning new skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's no better manifestation for us of learning than the the steep learning curve that comes from climbing, the high risk environment that it is, and all of the adventures that we've done up until now required a huge amount of grit and determination from Tom and I, but this was different in a sense that it came with a huge level of risk, which made it very interesting. There's a huge skill base that needed to be understood, and I think we maybe underestimated that. We gave ourselves 18 months to go from total novices to being good enough to climb El Capitan, and for a bit of context, that's usually a lifetime's worth of climbing. So we tried to fast track that, and with the first note of our main learnings around resilience is when you're actually learning a skill, you have to have resilience, because learning comes from trying and failing, essentially. And the positions that you guys are in, whether you're starting new businesses or you're looking at career options, it's going to be a series of trying something, failing, iterating and going back and trying something else. And it's a bit of a humbling experience, to be honest, because you have to realise that, you know, you're going to be wrong a lot of time. And this particular experience in climbing, that was the case. We had to be wrong, essentially, and we had to fail over and over again until we were good enough to be able to make our way up El Capitan, which, all in all, is a pretty massive feat in itself.
I think throughout all these adventures in that learning process, the one thing that we really kind of value and hone in on is basically surrounding yourself with amazing people. And obviously in Entfest in June, that was going to be the case. Everyone was going to be together surrounded by mentors and entrepreneurs. And that is so, so important for what we do. So we mentioned obviously earlier Alex Honnold, who is probably now the most famous climber of all time for climbing El Cap without ropes. We actually were lucky enough to train with him and Tommy Caldwell, who are probably the two most infamous climbers in the last 10 years. Absolute, the top of the elite. And we were obviously the bottom of the novice. And these guys kind of took us under their wing. And it was on our first night climbing up El Cap on our ascent. We arrived to this ledge about 7 hours later than we'd anticipated, in the middle of the night. And these guys were on the ledge sleeping, and they were on their own project, taking on this brand new route up El Cap. And what we kind of gained from watching them in this environment was just this confidence. They didn't question whether we could do it. They didn't question if it was likely or not we'd get to the top. They thought it was completely possible. And by having those people around us, giving us feedback and insights, that is what allows us to maybe push ourselves further and further and further outside our comfort zone, and learn as quickly as possible. And it wasn't just actually learning the skills that was important. It was also learning to adapt to a new environment. As James and I had never climbed before, the kind of thought of being 2,000 feet up a granite rock face, where your kind of every decision has huge consequences. So you're tying a knot that James is going to be rappelling on, or whatever it is. And if you do that knot incorrectly, he's going to fall. So the focus and the learning to actually operate in that environment was just as kind of important as learning to operate the skills themselves. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in at the moment with COVID. A lot of people are having to work from home or having to kind of juggle several kind of things. And it's learning to operate this new way. And doing these adventures has allowed us to kind of build that mentality quite robustly over the last few years.
Yeah, and I think going on to our second learning on resilience, and that really comes down to control the controllables. And what we mean by that is there's a huge amount of wasted energy and thought and negativity that comes from things that are totally outside of our control. We'll recognise it on a day-to-day from things like how the weather maybe affects our mood, or something like if a train being delayed. And when you think about it, there's absolutely nothing you can do about that situation, yet it has a huge impact on our mindset. And one of the biggest realizations for us on this point in particular came during the row. So if you, as Tom mentioned earlier, we're rowing 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day for 2 months. And in the warm up and the training for this, we potentially underestimated it in the fact that we'd never rowed at night before. We just considered it to be exactly the same thing, but a bit darker. And what I will say is that what you can see on your screen now is a visual representation of what it's like to row at night. It's unbelievably scary. Got no shame in saying that. It's petrifying where you can't see a few feet in front of your face. And that was the reality from day one. I think Tom had the first night shift, and I just remember being so thankful that it wasn't me that was about to row into the abyss, because there's no other sounds, there's nothing else around you, there's no reference points, it's just pitch black and you're rowing into the dark. Again, it's quite obvious that it was going to happen, and it became a bit of a battle with our mind to understanding that. And then the second thing that we were most worried about in our lead up, and probably the most asked question we got, was what happens if you capsize. And unfortunately, on the night of the 12th night, we actually got the answer to that question. So I was rowing in the pitch dark in the 4 a.m. till 6 a.m. shift. At this point, we still weren't used to rowing in the dark by any stretch. So rowing between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. and the way you measure the success of your 2-hour shift is just by staring at this little speedometer that is in front of you, and it basically tells you how much progress you're making towards where you're trying to get to. So for us, it was never very fast, but on this occasion, it was a relatively good shift. The wind was very high, the waves were big, which meant that we were surfing down them and making really good progress to Barbados. So it was a bit hairy, but at the same time, we were excited. And all of a sudden, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, this massive rogue wave just reared up on our right, and we got completely barreled, totally capsized. And I remember rowing at the time, whilst Tommy was in the cabin sleeping, and it felt like I got completely drop kicked. I got smashed off the boat, knocked over into the side of the ocean, kind of in the middle of the Atlantic, and kind of forced into this real slow motion feeling, which was so bizarre. My head torch got whipped off my head. I remember seeing it sinking with a little red light just flashing and just thinking, what on earth are we doing here? This is the scariest moment I'd ever had in my life, and the worst case scenario, or so we thought beforehand. Luckily, I had a lifeline on, which was a climbing harness with a rope which kept me attached to the boat. And if I didn't have that on, the boat just carries on going west towards the Caribbean, and I'd just be left there treading water essentially until I can't do that anymore. So a very sudden realization of how quickly this whole thing can end, and the sort of real dangers that we're in. But luckily, the lifeline did its job. It pulled tight, and I made my way gingerly back to the boat just as it self-righted. And as I kind of pulled myself back on the boat, the cabin door opened.
Yeah, so during this whole escapade, I was obviously asleep in the cabin, and when the boat flipped, I was kind of woke up on the ceiling with all of our belongings, and I genuinely thought the boat had been snapped in half and we were sinking. And after about 20 seconds, luckily the boat self-righted, and that's kind of due to the ballast that we put in there, and we packed it well enough that it came back round and I fell back down to earth with everything else. And then obviously I had the decision to make, because it was pitch black. I didn't know if we were underwater, above water, and if I opened the cabin and flooded the boat, we would have sunk, and that pretty much would have been it. So I kind of had to try and make the decision after about 30, 40 seconds of looking at the cabin door. I opened it eventually and found out we were just bobbing above the water level, but James was climbing back on the boat. And what was really interesting about this whole event was when we thought about it beforehand, we presumed that we'd just be in a state of panic, absolute headless chickens running around, not really knowing what to do. But what was really interesting was it was actually the exact opposite. And we went into this really process-driven state of figuring out what was wrong. So our rudder had come off and was dangling precariously off a piece of string off the back of the boat. We'd lost all of our spare sets of oars, and we were down to our bare minimum. We'd lost all of our water. We'd lost loads of sweets and food. And once we'd figured out everything, we made ourselves safe. James obviously was freezing cold and about to go into shock. So we had to get him warm and kind of set up and ready. And, a few hours later, we were actually laughing about it when the sun came up. And after that flip, we had this anxiety that it was going to happen again. And every time the sun went down, the mood on the boat would go with it when we hit the night shifts. And it took us a few days to realize that actually we can't control that. We'd hear waves during the night kind of bombing near us and just thankful that we weren't underneath them. But when we actually realized that we can't control those things, if it happens, we've done it before, we can do it again. And when you actually focus on only controlling what is within your kind of sphere of influence, that has a huge impact because you ignore the noise. And I think that is very kind of prominent with what's going on at the moment, with all the negativity coming in from the media and all this stuff that you have no control over. All you can do is focus on the things that you can affect. All you can do is worry about what you can control. And we've learned that time and time again. When you actually get that in your mindset, it's so much easier to think more positively. It's so much easier to be far more productive and efficient and progress. And it took a pretty severe kind of baptism of fire on the row in that capsize for us to actually realise that.
Yeah, totally. And that leads perfectly into our kind of final key learning on resilience. And that is having the ability to view obstacles as opportunities. And that comes from obviously being in difficult situations. And I think this current period that we're in now, the total unknown, nothing that anyone can really do about it here. But you've kind of got two options, and how you look at something and how you view a situation is the only thing that you can really control. And our first real understanding of that kind of came from the row as well. And so we capsized, we'd been through that early on, and we had land support that were based in the UK that were giving us regular weather updates. That was wrong 90% of the time, but it was someone to talk to. And they were giving us updates. So you kind of build an expectation based on what that person is telling you. So they said that everything was going to be good. There was a weather system up near North America's, if we saw it on charts, but not to worry about it. A couple of days later, we spoke to them again, and they said that system was moving south slightly. Nothing to worry about, but it might suck up some of our winds and weather and make rowing challenging for a couple of days. But then after that, we'll be cruising. We've got glorious weather all the way into Barbados, and we'll be making really good time. And 2 days after that, we actually ended up going through what was the first hurricane to form in that time of year in the Atlantic in the last 60 years. So our weather guys couldn't have been more wrong. And to put it bluntly, we felt initially cheated by the whole thing. If you can imagine, you've got a very simple existence at this point. We're stuck in a 7-meter rowing boat. We have one job in our life, basically, and that is to get to Barbados. Everything that we're doing in the 2 months at sea, but also the 18 months beforehand, it was all we really thought about, spoke about, raised money for, kind of communicated. And now for this period during this hurricane, not only can we not make any forward progress, we're actually being pushed back 100 miles. And this image here on the screen is from our tracker that's on our boat. And every blue dot is a GPS signal sent every 6 hours to our land support. So people are tracking our blog and tracking our progress. And as you can see, we're making fantastic progress. And then you can actually see where the hurricane hit, and we spent 3 days stuck in a tiny cabin the size of just over half a single bed. And it's the sweatiest, hottest place that you can't really move. Our food was outside, and it was a huge obstacle, a huge challenge that actually we had very little control over.
Yeah, and when we heard about this hurricane heading towards us, and when we went into it, we reacted really negatively. And we kind of had this idea that everything was against us, and why was us, and all this stuff was happening. And it took about 8 hours of moaning and crying about it for us to actually have a pretty firm conversation with ourselves and realised, you know what, right, we're now 1,500 miles across the Atlantic. We are in the middle. And up to this point, we were still novices. We were really struggling with a routine. We were still scared of the dark. We weren't eating right. The rowing regime was really taking its toll. And now we had this forced break, this 3-day pretty much period where we couldn't row. And instead of seeing that as a negative, we actually turned it on its head and it became a positive. We now had time to rest. as much as you can in a rowing boat in a hurricane, but we watched films on the iPad, we ate as much as we could, we slept as much as we could. And over those 3 days, we don't know exactly when it happened, but something changed. And it was like someone had just turned on a light bulb. And we came out of that hurricane with this unbelievable desire and this fire beneath us to get to Barbados. And we became completely at home on the boat. And we put that change down to something that we're firm believers in, that if you push yourself outside of your comfort zone far enough for long enough, that is where the progress and innovation happens rapidly. That is where you grow. That is where you better yourself. And we had done that to such a dramatic extent. We were so far outside our comfort zone. That learning curve was so steep. And we became unbelievably fit. It is incredible what your body can do when you ask the right questions. We went from struggling in the 2-hour shifts to rowing together for 10 hours in the day and then going into shifts at the night. And we basically just began to enjoy the row. Every moment after that became a genuine joy. And we sat down and ate dinners together, watched every sunset. And we eventually came into Barbados as, you know, we had the beards, we'd lost the weight, we had the tans, but the biggest change that we found was that we'd actually realised our own potential. We'd left Gran Canaria not really understanding it and taking a risk. But the simplest form we can put that down to is when we hit Barbados, we removed the word can't from our vocab. And that is basically, when people ask us for one word of advice on how to, whether it's starting a business or taking a risk or doing an adventure, the one bit of advice that we give is try and remove the word can't from everything you do. And a lot of people on this call, although you're amazingly young, you're still thinking about business and where you want to be in the next few years. And by simply removing that word, you are bringing down so many barriers that might be in the way, because you'll be told constantly that you can't do things or you're not capable. We've dealt with that every adventure for the last 4 years. We've dealt with it when we took it full time. There was a big risk. We were leaving our jobs in London. Everyone said we can't do it. And we're here today speaking to you guys, telling you that you actually can. And by developing this mindset of resilience and this growth mindset and pushing yourself constantly, what you can achieve is genuinely endless. And I think before we get into the questions, by the way, drop a few questions for us. We're going to go on to a Q&A now. But there's also a poll that we want you to answer. And would you rather yourself personally row across the Atlantic Ocean or climb 3,000 foot up El Capitan and sleep in situations like this? This was our last night's sleep on El Cap. So answer those questions and get them in. And I think hopefully from today, what you've gained is, you know, if we can go and do this stuff and if we can start a business off the back of it. We also run a separate business called Dose, which is around embedding growth mindsets into businesses. And eventually we're going to do universities as well, because we think having a growth mindset is the best skill you can have as a young person going into the business world, because it just breaks down any kind of limitations that people will say that you have. So get those questions in now, guys. Answer the poll. We'll be interested to see. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we'll go on to answer some questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I think we would like to challenge you, I suppose, as well, over the when you get away from your desk or you're back at home or whatever it is, to just have a think about those 3 points and how you've maybe implemented those over the last couple of months, or if you can. So the first one being, you know, are there any opportunities for you to learn something new, a new skill? A lot of people find they've got more time during this period if they're at home a bit more. Like we said, we learn a huge amount about ourselves from trying to learn a new skill. The second thing would be on controlling the controllables. Has there been times where you've maybe thrown yourself into a panic or suffered with a bit of anxiety, and when you look back on it, you realise that it was something completely out of your control? I think we would challenge you to spend your valuable energy and time thinking about something that you can control. Take ownership over something and try and make an impact in something which you can do, rather than worry about something that you can't. And then finally, maybe taking this current period that we're in particular and just trying to see potential opportunities in this period, rather than viewing it as a pain in the neck and a massive obstacle and something that is disrupting every industry, but trying to view it as an opportunity instead of an obstacle, and whether that is an opportunity to see family more or communicate with friends in a different way or learn something new about people, then I think those three things we'd like to challenge you guys to try and do in some way. And I think if you start doing that, then you're off on the right foot, that's for sure.
Okay, so questions. So, James, shall I pick one and answer it? And whilst I'm doing that, you pick one?
Yeah, sounds good. Go for it.
I think I'm going to group a few questions that are in the same kind of bracket, which interestingly we get asked quite a lot. So I know Anna's asked this, Scott has asked this, Bill has asked this, and it's around how do we make money off being adventurers and how do we fund the adventures themselves? And it's a really good question, because I think a lot of people have this idea of going and doing these big things, but then they suddenly realise it costs a lot of money. You know, for the road, for example, we had to raise almost £100,000 just to go and do the thing. And, you know, the blueprint for adventure back in the old days was you get one big sponsor, a newspaper, and they give you all the money. But now with kind of social media and adventure becoming almost a trend in itself, it becomes harder and harder to do that. And to give you a bit of background, James and I met, we met about 10 years ago in the marketing team at Red Bull. So our background is marketing, specifically brand marketing. So we had an asset and a skill base that we knew kind of what brands would want to see. We knew there was a value in the content that we were creating, because we are like 99% of the audience watching. We are not elite. We're not kind of professional athletes. We're showing that people can actually go do this stuff with the right mindset. So it is still probably the hardest thing we do is raising money for these challenges, no matter how big and great they sound. Getting people to put cash into it and getting them to back it is so tricky. So, you know, what we try and do is we'll think of the adventure first. Let's say LCAP, for example, or the row is probably a good one. We thought about the row and we thought, right, what brands can we bring into this story that fit? So we worked with Dropbox, who are a cloud storage system, and we were the first people ever to use Dropbox to kind of exchange media in the middle of the Atlantic. We had Jaybird headphones, which we used. Spotify we worked with to create the ultimate playlist. Basically, every brand had its place and had its own story. So we go about making a list, and then it's just persistence. We sent thousands of emails, and we got probably 1% reply, and then 0.5% actually said yes. So in short, it is just persistence, but it's figuring out your story. That's the key thing. If you just fire out generic emails to people, you'll get 100% no's. So it's finding out how you do it, what the adventure is and how the hook is, and then you go after them in that way. So that's kind of how we make money through adventures and funding it. We also do a lot of speaking, obviously, usually in person at corporates. And we obviously have our separate business, Dose, which is a learning and development kind of training company around embedding these learnings and mindset into companies like Airbnb and Nike and Aviva. So there are different ways of doing it, but you know, it's been a struggle the last 4 years. Being a professional venture isn't conventional. We've had to certainly be very flexible in how we make money and how we generate revenue. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but we've managed to make it work and we've stuck it out and we're in a good position now.
Right, I'm going to answer the question from Elizabeth McEwen, which is, what do you think motivates you to do such high-risk things? Is it just the want for excitement and exploration? And I think that is obviously a draw, is doing things like this, but we are not, we're not adrenaline junkies, or, you know, we're not like seeking this thrill and this rush. What actually motivates us is the process of breaking down something that seems so ridiculous and so huge and something that is reserved for the elite of the elite in their sport, and actually breaking it down into manageable chunks that means that we can go and do stuff like that. And the climb of LCAP is a perfect example. It's touted as a lifelong climbing ambition for people around the world, and they spend years and years and years going through different things. And what interests us is actually looking at that process on a whole and breaking it down into manageable bits. And that comes from like speaking to mentors and surrounding ourselves with the perfect people and learning from the very very best, like we showed, like Alex and Tommy, having those experiences with people that are at the top of their game is incredibly motivating, and that really interests us. And I think ultimately for us, we are motivated by showing other people what's possible. So kind of like we're wanting to show you guys today, if we can go and do this stuff with no climbing experience, but 18 months of the right attitude and the will to learn, we can kind of go and complete this. Then what are you guys personally capable of in whatever industry or topic that you want to go into? And, you know, in this occasion, it might be starting your own business, but it's obviously a hugely daunting thing. But I think our motivation is to show that these things are totally possible, and they're not reserved for a few people. They're reserved for the people that go out and get it and go out and do it. And that's just a matter of attitude. So I think that is our motivation, but our adventures, it manifests itself in a big thing like climbing El Cap or rowing the Atlantic or whatever we decide to do next. And yeah, that is our key motivation.
Okay, I've got a good one. I'm actually going to pair two questions kind of back to back because they're quite relevant. The first one's from Raneem, and it says, what's your biggest bit of advice for a 16-year-old who is thinking about starting a business? I think firstly, if you're thinking about starting a business at 16, you're light years ahead of us. That was never really, when we were 16, we weren't anywhere near that kind of progress in our thinking. But from our, from our experience starting the Tempest Two, leaving our jobs and starting Dose as well, I think the biggest bit of advice is to sit down, look at the business, and then think, what is the worst thing that could happen by you starting this business? Because so many people are afraid of becoming entrepreneurs or leaving the safety of their job because there's just this stigma around it. What if you fail? And I think when we asked ourselves that question, it was, right, okay, we both had great jobs in London. We'll leave our jobs. We'll do this for 6 months. It will completely bomb. And then we'll just get another job. And that was kind of the worst case scenario. And I think when you view it like that, it's not really a worst case scenario. There's a lot of worse things that can happen. Obviously, everyone's kind of situation varies, but our biggest word of advice would be to actually think, what's the worst thing that can happen? Even if it goes wrong, you're going to learn more in those 6 months than you would working in a company for 5 years. I guarantee you that. And then pairing it with Maram's question around how have we challenged ourselves through this pandemic? And this kind of links to what I've just said to Raneem's question. So our two businesses, the Tempest Two with our speaking and Dose, are all face-to-face. So when this COVID hit, we had a pipeline of 6 months of talks and workshops and great kind of revenue that was overnight just taken from underneath us. And instead of panicking and worrying about it, we're like, right, how can we make a change to make ourselves sustainable during this time? And we've basically decided a couple of months ago, we were talking about it, but now it's accelerated the process that Dose, our learning and development company, is going to be fully digital. So we've raised money from investors during this period to build a platform that we're going to create content for and roll out through corporate clients. And it's going to completely redesign what our business is for the better. So although it's scary and kind of we're working flat out to make it a possibility, we're going to come out of this pandemic definitely with a stronger business and with a huge amount of learnings. And I think just by doing that, having that approach of seeing this opportunity in the obstacle, it kind of, no matter what is thrown at you, if you're resilient, you can kind of be flexible and go with it and kind of make positives out of those situations.
Yeah, I love that. Right, sorry, I realised I was just still sharing my screen, so hopefully now you can still see Tom and I a bit larger. You can actually see who we are. I'm going to try and put a couple of questions together. I'm actually going to answer one of the questions with one of the other ones as well. And question was from Maram, particularly the part, do you think that it's ever too late to take a life-changing risk? There are factors that affect what or when you should take them. And I think Tom touched on it just then. Everyone's in different situations, and I think there's no real right time. There's always a reason not to do something, whether it's a mortgage payment or a family, something or other going on, or a job that you're currently in, or a potential promotion down the line or whatever it is. There's never the perfect time to do it. And I think the reason people don't do it is they tell themselves all these things. Maybe they tell themselves that they're scared of failing ultimately, to touch on Tom's point, that people don't want to go and do something and then fail. Because realistically, as Tom said, the failure means you learn a lot and you go somewhere else to make money or do something different, and actually you've learned a lot about yourself. But it's quite hard to take the fact that you've actually finally gone for something, and if it doesn't work, that's a potential scary situation. So I'm going to answer that question and recommend a book. A question from James was a book recommendation. Luckily, I've got my bookshelf here. But there's a really cool author who we read quite a lot on, which is about this sort of stuff. And the author is called Ryan Holiday. The first book would be The Obstacle is the Way. And that is about kind of Stoic philosophy, but essentially very similar to what we've been speaking about today. Seeing opportunities in less than favourable situations. The second one, which is probably more relevant to this question, is Ego is the Enemy. So the same author. And that's about kind of not believing your own hype and that sort of thing. The ego is what gets in the way of people trying to do something new, because the fear of failure means that they might not be living up to whatever perception they think they have in other people's heads. So ultimately, not believing your own hype and going for something is the reason why a lot of people don't do something in the first place. So I'd say just throw that out the window and go for it. So hopefully those two kind of answered those questions.
Cool. Next one, I've actually forgotten who's written it, but it was, have we ever fallen out on an adventure? And if so, how did we deal with it? And this is actually an interesting question for a number of reasons. I think if you're ever planning on starting a business or taking on an adventure with another person, that is the biggest decision you make when you start off on these things. Because if you do it with the wrong person, it goes from being an amazing, life-changing event to one of the worst things you'll ever do. And when we were researching the Atlantic Row, we spoke to people who'd done it in the past or similar things. And they said that the people you do it with, or the person you do it with, in our case, you will absolutely despise. You will argue the whole time. It'll be the worst thing you've ever done until you get to Barbados. And so we were expecting to fall out. Because we've been told that's what would happen. And obviously when you're in a confined space, the boat was 7 meters long, the cabin was the size of a single bed for 2 months with the same person, there's obviously going to be friction. But I think James and I are pretty proud of the fact that we've actually never fallen out on an adventure. We've never had a row. And we put that down to the fact that we're obviously quite compatible, but we're both in it for the same reason. And there's no egos. James was saying ego is the enemy in these situations. And if you had two people who are elite, I'll give you an example. Ben Fogle and James Cracknell rode the Atlantic a few years before us. James Cracknell was obviously a multi-gold medal winning Olympic rower. Ben Fogle had no experience rowing. And from day two, they were fighting, they were crying, they'd fallen out. And the whole thing was just this battle between these two kind of goals, whereas Cracknell wanted to break the world record. He wanted to row a 1% harder, put everything into it. Whereas Fogle, who isn't a competitor, just wanted to get to the other side safely to see his family again. And if you have those two opposites in a business environment or an adventure environment, it doesn't work. And James and I are luckily both rubbish at everything. So when we take on an adventure and something breaks, we're not like, it should be done that way or it should be done that way. We're both like, what the hell is that? And how do we fix it? So we're always kind of bound by this naivety. And there's nothing wrong not being an expert or not having an expert in your team, because you can learn those things together. So, yeah, I would say we've never fallen out to date. And that's purely because we are fully aligned on our purpose and our goals. And that kind of helps us from doing so.
Yeah, for sure. Right, I'm going to go to a question from Scott Laidlaw, which I've just realised you can see that it's had the most upvotes. So how did you keep your mental health when rowing in the darkness so far from anywhere? And it's a good question. I think in a nutshell, we had challenging times. Of course, we did for 2 months at sea. And I guess mental health You experience great times and high highs and low lows. And I think we managed because we were open, we communicated with each other honestly, number one. We had quite a solid routine, which I think contributes massively to a positive mental health. Even though our routine was very simple and basic, we placed importance on that routine, whether it was making a coffee in the morning, rowing the 2-hour shifts on and off, whatever it was. We obviously got a lot of exercise, which is incredibly important for that sort of thing. And we had a goal and we had a strong purpose. So I think the combination of those 4 things meant that during those tough times when you're rowing in the middle of the night by yourself, just with your thoughts, you can go to one of those things, and it was a strong enough feeling for us, strong enough purpose of why we were in that position. I think if we'd been put that way or challenged differently, then it would have been more difficult. And the challenging times came for us, as we mentioned earlier, when we couldn't control things like the hurricane, like the capsize, and our routine was thrown completely out of whack, out of something that we couldn't control. So when we got back to our routine, we placed our importance on those key things. It became all of a sudden very manageable, and actually probably the healthiest I've felt in my life probably was over those 2 months at sea and the initial week after. And I think that came from the combination of all those things that I've just said.
Okay, let's get on to, I think we've got about 10 more minutes of questions, guys, just under. So make sure you get your questions in now. Keep kind of voting on the poll as well, and we'll reveal that at the end. But some exciting stuff now. So we've got a question that is, did you have any near-death experiences on the climb? If so, how did you carry on? So the climb itself was obviously over 3 days, but there was about a year's preparation that went into that, learning how to climb, learning the roping systems, all that kind of stuff that we mentioned. And there are a few moments that stand out. I think on El Cap itself, I think James will remember this better than I will, but we were about 1,500 feet up on a training climb, and we were pretty tired. Had a pretty brutal schedule of training up to that point, and we were on a ledge called Sickle, which is like a natural ledge on El Cap, and we were there, and we were getting ready to rappel down to the ground to go back to our van. And we were there having a bit of food, some drink, taking in the views of the amazing Yosemite Valley, and then we realised that James actually wasn't clipped in. And the number one rule in climbing, especially big wall climbing, is you have all these kind of systems on you, and one is basically a carabiner with a rope to your harness, and you always clip in. And we were so tired and complacent that James had just forgotten to do so. And he was walking around, looking over the edge. We were 1,500 feet above the deck at that point. And it suddenly realised, I was like, mate, don't move. And I was like, you're not clipped in. And he suddenly like froze and put his back clipped in. That is where most of the accidents happens in climbing. It's just a little bit of cloud in the mind, and you don't do things that you should do. Another one was during the training in 70 again. We were climbing a route that actually was taking longer than it should have, and then it got really dark. So it was pitch black, and I was leading the route, and basically placed the cam, went to finish it because it was really easy at the end of it, and didn't place any more protection. I got my foot stuck in a crack, couldn't get it out, and as I yanked it out, I basically ejected backwards off the wall, fell about 45 feet through the darkness upside down. Luckily, the piece of gear caught me. James was below me, belaying me from the ground. He was scared that he was going to get eaten by bears. So I think he was pretty shocked when he heard my screams falling. But constantly we had these challenges where we'd fall and we'd hurt an ankle or we'd pull a muscle. And to be honest, with the climb, we were so anxious and scared every time we went climbing because it was so far outside our comfort zone, and it was just, the consequences are so black and white with climbing a big wall that, you know, if you fall, you're going to hit the floor. And if you hit the floor, you're in big trouble. So getting back up every morning, we had a lot of self-talk. We both used Headspace, which is a meditation app that kind of helps us kind of focus in on things. And we just built this process over time of, even if we take a big hit, a big fall, we'll get back up and we'll finish the job. But yeah, there were moments that, you know, we'll look back on and think, Christ, we were seriously lucky, and we've had that across the adventures. But you know, when you're in that moment, you don't think about it, you just get on with it. And it's when you get home and you're having a coffee alone in your kitchen that you suddenly think, wow, that could have gone a lot differently. But yeah, there's been some pretty exciting stories for sure.
Right, I'm going to answer one from Bill Muirhead, and he says, do you think there are any limits to learning? You both seem to have learned very difficult disciplines in short periods of time. What is the learning secret? And I guess very short answer to that, a learning secret is motivation. It's classic. It goes all the way back to being in school and being a subject that you don't like. You're far more likely to not engage, and that's the same position that we're in now with all of these adventures. And luckily, it all links with our purpose and our motivation is all relatively aligned, so that when it comes to learning, we're motivated to do so. And kind of linked to what Tom was saying now and what we have been doing in launching this new business is we've both been learning about coding, learning about different computer programs, kind of trying to upskill. And I think if I sat down in front of that content this time a year ago or even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. But because there's a direct link between what we're learning now and what our future holds, there's a huge amount of motivation for it, and we're really getting stuck into it. So I think that the secret is being honest with yourself about if you're motivated to do something, and then setting realistic goals on that learning. So we're doing about half an hour a day on something because it seems realistic, achievable, and it's enough to keep you motivated, rather than, right, I want to sit down and learn about coding for 3 hours a day because I'll do one day and be sick of it and never get back involved. So a combination of motivation and setting realistic targets means that, yeah, eventually I think you're on the right learning journey. And that's what we do with all our adventures.
Okay, I think maybe one more, then we will reveal the poll. I think I'll go for this one. Anastasia has asked, having a business that is so reliant on being active and well, do you have any worries or contingencies in place if one of you have an accident or cause an injury? Really good question, actually. So I think it's not necessarily a contingency for us, but with the speaking side of the Tempest Two, that is obviously our main source of revenue. With brands for the adventures, we raise the money to pay for the adventure. And everything over and the top, we usually give to an environmental charity. So, you know, if one of us broke our leg and we had to delay an adventure, we wouldn't have a huge economical hit because we can still usually deliver talks. And Dose obviously is kind of our focus for the long term. I think the Tempest 2 is this amazing brand that we're so proud of, and it's pushed us to places we never thought we'd be. And we gain these huge adventure learnings every time we do something. But then those learnings go into our other company, Dose. And that is what we really want to scale over the next few years. There's a couple of questions around where do you see ourselves in 5-10 years time. And, we want Dose to be a platform which inspires people such as yourselves. I think we really want to get it into universities within the first couple of years, as well as businesses, to try and get people to think differently, to try and get people to back themselves and unlock their potential. So, if one of us did have an injury, then it wouldn't really impact us that badly, other than maybe delaying an adventure. But hopefully what you guys have taken from today, I'm just looking at the poll now. I'm interested to see. Oh, it's tight. Whittle, guess what you think it is in terms of percentage, rowing the Atlantic or LCAP?
I would say 60-40 in favour of LCAP.
Oh, not bad. It's 51% LCAP, 49% row the Atlantic.
Ooh.
Which would you rather do again?
LCAP, I reckon.
You reckon?
Yeah.
No, LCAP was scary, man.
Yeah, it was.
Right, so just over half of you would rather climb LCAP. Go and do it. Good luck. It's a hell of an experience, but it's pretty scary. But guys, firstly, thank you so much for listening to us. Obviously, we'd have loved to do this in person, but hopefully we've added some value and something a bit different today. If you have any questions for us that you didn't want to put out in the open, follow us on Instagram at the Tempest Two. Visit our website. Fire everything over. We're happy to help. Whether it's adventure ideas, business strategy, whatever it is, fire it over. And yeah, we look forward to hopefully seeing you guys next year. And good luck with all your endeavours.
And thank you so much, Tom and James. This was unbelievable. I think they were all inspired to sort of use our now quarantine time to get outside. If it's learning how to cycle, if it's just walking more, being, pushing ourselves in some way, shape, or form. And I think what was one of the really key learnings today, I think that there's a great deal of strengths in naivety, and actually not being good at something, not knowing that you're not good at it, can actually push you forward. So maybe people who are thinking about starting their own business and thinking they don't know enough and that's holding them back should realize actually they're in a really good position, because you're constantly learning and it's an opportunity to do things your own way, not build on some maybe bad habits.
Totally. Yeah, 100%.
So I've shared all the Tempest 2 links above. Do get in touch with them, follow them on social media. They've been absolutely brilliant today. Please join me in thanking them in the comment section. Thank you both so much, and thank you everyone who tuned in. We'll share the webinar recording afterwards, but go and explore the Tempest 2 YouTube channel. It's wild. Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Bye.